Imagine a world without countries as we know them today. Think of a time before smartphones, before cars, even before printed books. This was the world of the Middle Ages. This was a period of history that stretched for a very long time, about 1,000 years. This era began around the year 500 and ended around the year 1500. It is called the Middle Ages because it sits in the middle of two other major periods in European history. Before it came the mighty Roman Empire, great cities, powerful armies. After it came the Renaissance, new art, new ideas, new discoveries. This long stretch of time was not just a quiet pause, it was full of change, conflict and creation. During these 1,000 years, Europe was not a single unified place. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, small territories and powerful lords. People's lives were very different from our own. Most individuals never traveled more than a few miles from the village where they were born. They worked the land from sunrise to sunset, their lives governed by the changing seasons and the rules of their local lord. Religion, specifically Christianity, was at the center of everything. It shaped how people understood the world, how they marked time, and how they hoped for a better life after death. Great cathedrals were built that reached for the heavens, testaments to a deep and powerful faith that united people across different lands. This long period was not a single, unchanging story. It was a time of dramatic ups and downs, a roller coaster of progress and disaster. There were moments of brilliant light, with kings like Charlemagne who tried to build a new Roman Empire, uniting vast lands under his rule. There were times of deep darkness, like the arrival of the Black Death, a terrible plague that swept across the continent, changing society forever. Knights in shining armor became famous figures, fighting in tournaments and wars bound by a code of honor. But for most people, life was a daily struggle for survival, a constant effort to find enough food and stay safe from danger. Understanding the Middle Ages is like opening a door to our own past. It helps us see where many of our modern ideas, languages, and nations came from. The foundations of modern Europe were laid during this time. New ways of farming were invented, which allowed populations to grow. Universities were founded, becoming centers of learning that still exist today. The conflicts and alliances between kings and queens slowly started to draw the lines that would become the countries we now see on a map. This was not a dark age of ignorance, but a complex and fascinating time that built the world we inherited. So why should we care about this distant past? Why do these 1,000 years matter to us today on May 24th, 2024? The answer is simple. The Middle Ages are not as far away as they seem. The echoes of this era are all around us. English, French, Spanish, the fairy tales we tell our children are filled with castles, dragons, brave knights, and they have their roots in medieval stories and legends, the very idea of a king or queen and a parliament. Laws that apply to everyone started to take shape in these centuries. It was a time when big questions about power, faith, community were being asked, and their answers still influence us. Think about the great struggles that defined the Middle Ages. There were epic wars like the Crusades, where armies from Europe traveled thousands of miles to fight for control of the Holy Land. These conflicts changed relationships between Christians, Muslims, Jews, and for centuries. There were also internal struggles, with powerful nobles challenging kings, leading to documents like the Magna Carta in England. This famous charter, signed in 1215, introduced the idea that even a king was not above the law, a revolutionary concept, a small seed for later democratic principles. The period also saw inventions that set the stage for the future. The heavy plough transformed agriculture, letting more food be grown on Northern Europe's clay soils. More food meant more people could be fed, which led to larger towns and cities. Eyeglasses helped older scholars keep working, preserving and expanding knowledge. Near the end, Gutenberg's printing press changed the world. Books and ideas spread faster and wider than ever, sparking massive social and religious change. Ultimately, the Middle Ages were a crucible where modern Europe was forged. Deep faith, brutal warfare, brilliant art, devastating plagues, powerful kings, powerless peasants. By looking at key moments, we can see the journey that led us here. This essay will take you on a journey through those moments, one turning point at a time. The story of the Middle Ages does not begin with a grand new building or a famous king. Instead, it starts with an ending. It begins with the slow, painful collapse of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever known, the Roman Empire. For centuries, Rome had been the center of the world for many Europeans. Its legions, its laws, its language. From the cold lands of Britain to the sunny shores of North Africa, people lived under Roman rule. They used Roman coins, they walked on Roman roads. They looked to the emperor in Rome as the ultimate source of power. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, this mighty empire was starting to crack under immense pressure from both within and without. The problems were numerous and deep. The empire had become too large to govern effectively. Imagine trying to send a message from one end of a huge kingdom to another with only horses and boats. It took weeks, sometimes months. This made it difficult for emperors to respond to crises quickly. The economy was also in trouble. Constant wars were expensive, and heavy taxes were placed on ordinary people, making their lives very hard. Political instability was another major issue. Emperors were often assassinated. Powerful generals fought each other for control of the throne, creating civil wars that weakened the state. The empire was like a giant, ancient tree with rotting roots, ready to topple in a strong wind. The final push came from outside. Groups of people, who the Romans called barbarians, began to move into Roman territory. These were not wild savages, but entire peoples on the move. The Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, they were seeking new lands to settle, sometimes fleeing from other, more fearsome invaders like the Huns from Central Asia. At first, some were allowed to settle peacefully inside the empire's borders, even serving in the Roman army. But as more and more groups arrived, the borders could no longer hold. They crossed the great rivers, the Rhine, the Danube, overwhelming Roman defenses. The year 476 is often used as a symbolic date for the end of the Western Roman Empire. In that year, the last Roman emperor in the West, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was removed from power by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. There was no great battle for the city of Rome, no dramatic final stand. It was more like a quiet fading away. The power that had once held much of Europe together was gone. In its place was a vacuum, a great emptiness of authority. This collapse was the event that truly opened the door to the Middle Ages. It shattered the old world and created a new, uncertain landscape where new kingdoms and new leaders would rise. With the central authority of Rome gone, Europe began to look very different. The old unified map with its neat Roman provinces was torn apart. In its place, a new and much more complicated map started to be drawn. The Germanic tribes that had migrated into the empire did not just pass through, they stayed and carved out kingdoms for themselves. These new kingdoms were not built on the Roman model of a centralized state. Instead, they were based on the personal loyalty of warriors to their chief or king. Power was no longer held by an abstract idea like the state. It was held by powerful individuals who could command loyalty through strength and gifts. In the lands that were once Roman Gaul, a powerful group called the Franks established a kingdom that would eventually become modern-day France. Their famous king, Clovis, united the Frankish tribes in the late 5th century. He converted to Christianity. By adopting the religion of the people he had conquered, he won the support of the church and the Gallo-Roman population. This alliance between Frankish kings and the Christian church became a defining feature of the early Middle Ages. His kingdom became a major power in the new European order. Other new kingdoms sprouted up all over the former empire. In Spain, the Visigoths created their own realm. In Italy, the Ostrogoths and later the Lombards took control of the peninsula. Across the sea in North Africa, the Vandals established a kingdom, disrupting Mediterranean trade. Meanwhile, the island of Britain, abandoned by Roman legions, was settled by newcomers from northern Germany and Denmark. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They pushed the native Celts west into what is now Wales and Cornwall. They established several small kingdoms that would one day form England. This period was a time of great change and often great violence. The new kingdoms were frequently at war with each other. The old Roman cities began to shrink as trade routes broke down and life became more dangerous. People moved into the countryside, seeking protection from powerful local lords. The world became smaller and more localized. A person's identity was no longer Roman, but tied to their tribe, Frank, Goth, Saxon, or to the small village where they lived. This fragmentation set the stage for a new society known as feudalism. As the political power of Rome crumbled, Another power was growing stronger and more influential. This was the Christian Church. In the final centuries of the Roman Empire, Christianity had transformed from a persecuted minority religion into the official faith of the state. When the empire in the West fell apart, the Church did not collapse with it. Instead, it became one of the few surviving institutions that offered a sense of continuity and order in a chaotic world. Bishops and priests became important local leaders. The new Germanic kings faced a choice. Leaders like Clovis of the Franks converted to Roman Catholicism. Monasteries played a crucial role. In scriptoriums, they painstakingly copied texts by hand, not just the Bible. Roman poets, Roman philosophers, Roman scientists. Without their work, much ancient knowledge would have been lost. The Church influenced every aspect of daily life. People were baptized, people were married, people were buried. In the 8th century, a leader emerged who would turn that dream into a reality. His name was Charles, but history remembers him as Charlemagne. Over a reign of more than 4 decades, Charlemagne relentlessly expanded his kingdom, creating a vast empire. Christmas Day 800, Charlemagne was in Rome. Pope Leo III suddenly placed a crown on his head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. This coronation marked the birth of what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire. After his death in 814, his empire did not last long. The empire was officially divided into 3 parts by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. These 3 kingdoms would eventually form the basis for the modern nations of France, Germany. He was also a passionate advocate for education and culture. This led to a period of renewed intellectual and artistic activity known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Under Alcuin's guidance, a new curriculum was established for schools, set up in cathedrals and monasteries across the empire. One of the most important and lasting innovations of this period was the development of a new style of handwriting, called Carolingian minuscule. Most of the lowercase letters we use in English today are directly descended from this Carolingian script. This revival also saw a flourishing of art and architecture, and most notably his magnificent Palatine Chapel in his capital city of Aachen. Artists in the monasteries produced beautiful illuminated manuscripts. The cultural and intellectual seeds planted during the Carolingian Renaissance would continue to grow, shaping the development of European thought for centuries to come. After Charlemagne's great empire broke apart, Europe plunged into instability and danger. New waves of invaders threatened fragmented kingdoms from all directions. From the north, Vikings. People needed immediate, reliable protection. They found it in a new kind of fortress, the castle. Stone castles were military marvels built for defense. The castle was more than a military base. It was the regional center of power. This new order, centered on castle and lord, is called feudalism. It depended on personal loyalty and mutual obligation. At the heart of the feudal system was a new kind of warrior, the knight. However, becoming a knight was incredibly expensive. Only wealthy men could afford to equip themselves. A boy destined to become a knight began his training at a very young age. He would become a squire. If a squire proved his courage and skill, he would eventually be made a knight in a special ceremony called a dubbing. To guide the behavior of these powerful and dangerous warriors, a special code of conduct developed over time, known as chivalry. They participated in tournaments, which were great public spectacle, and a chance for a knight to win fame, fortune, and the admiration of high-born ladies. While lords and knights lived in castles, the vast majority, perhaps more than 90%, were peasants. Peasants lived in the village in simple huts. Most peasants were not free. They were known as serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. The serfs had to work on the lord's personal land and also had to give the lord a portion of the crops they grew on their own strips of land. The farming system used on most manors was the 3-field system. Life for a peasant was a constant struggle for survival. Their diet was simple. Despite the hardships, they also had a strong sense of community, which provided a welcome break from the relentless cycle of work. The 14th century began with a series of immense challenges that would shake the foundations of medieval society. Starting around the year 1315, a period of unusually cold and rainy summers began. This little ice age had a catastrophic effect on agriculture. This led to a devastating food shortage known as the Great Famine. millions of people faced starvation and severe malnutrition. The price of grain skyrocketed, making it impossible for poor families to afford even a simple loaf of bread. As if the famine was not enough, a new and exceptionally long conflict was brewing. In 1337, war broke out between England and France and became known as the 100 Years' War. At famous battles like Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, English archers unleashed devastating storms of arrows that could pierce the armor of the French knights. These shocking defeats demonstrated that the age of the chivalrous knight was coming to an end. In 1347, trading ships from the Black Sea docked in a port in Sicily. They carried a deadly passenger, a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This was the cause of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, spread by fleas living on black rats. The plague spread with terrifying speed. The symptoms of the plague were horrific. Painful swellings would turn black as the tissue died. Society seemed to be falling apart. People abandoned their families and fled the cities. It is estimated the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, as many believed the plague was a punishment from God, leading to extreme religious fervor. The surviving peasants felt a new sense of their own value. They began to demand more freedom and higher pay. This tension exploded into uprisings. 1381, the Peasants' Revolt in England. They marched on London. These revolts were often brutally suppressed. The ruling class reasserted control, yet the uprisings left a lasting impact. Their serfdom gradually withered in much of Western Europe. The disasters of the 14th century cracked medieval society, paving the way for a new world. The 15th century saw the slow but steady beginnings of a powerful recovery, driven by the revival and expansion of trade. In Northern Europe, a new trading network emerged, the Hanseatic League. Trade spawned a new class, merchants and bankers, whose wealth came from commerce and finance. Growing towns demanded self-government. They fought for and won charters of liberty. Craft guilds organized artisans and regulated quality. For most of the Middle Ages, knowledge was a rare and precious commodity. Books were incredibly expensive. Around 1450 in Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg perfected a revolutionary invention, the printing press with movable type. Individual metal letters, arranged to form words, locked into a frame, inked, pressed onto paper. Books could now be produced quickly, cheaply, and in huge numbers. Books once exclusive to the rich became available to many. New challenging ideas spread like wildfire, fueling the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. The quiet clatter of the press sounded the death knell for the medieval world and heralded the modern age. The 1,000 years we call the Middle Ages were not a dark and empty gap in history. They were a time of profound and lasting transformation. It was a period that gave us towering cathedrals, formidable castles, the code of chivalry, and the founding of the first universities. Yet this world was shattered and remade by terrible crises, which shook the old certainties to their core. The final act of the Middle Ages was driven by innovation, the growth of cities, and the invention of the printing press. When we look back, we are not just seeing kings and knights, but our own origins. This period laid the political, religious, and cultural cornerstones of our world, making it an essential chapter in Europe's story.